Okay, stand by. Yeah, so welcome back, everyone. So now we have a interesting panel discussion on biosimilars, opportunities, challenges, and outlook. We will also take up some questions from the last session, which Edric so nicely summarized his thoughts in less than half an hour. So it's my pleasure, first of all, to introduce Dinesh Kundu, co-founder and director, QBD Biosciences in India. Dinesh is an experienced healthcare industry professional with experience in portfolio strategy, biologics program management, licensing strategies. As I just mentioned, he is the founder of QBD Biosciences, and he runs this company with the vision to bring the best technology of biosimilars, novel biologics, and gene therapy to Indian and emerging markets. So QBD, quality by design. So the best practices make a lot of good connection. So
thanks a lot, Samir.
So welcome both of you, and it's a pleasure for me to moderate this session and hear from two experts, and very interesting panel today. One of panel members located, one of the panel members joining from US, the other one joining from other extreme end, India, and I'm in the middle in Frankfurt. So let's see how it goes. So some initial comments by you, Dinesh, before we jump into some of the questions, or you would like to take the questions straight away, and whichever way you like, and then I can add some questions from the audience.
I think, Samir, my suggestion is if we take the questions, that sets the flow. So if it is okay with you, let's start with that, because already there was a session with Edric, so we can follow up into that.
Yeah, okay. So I think one of the topics here is how should companies compare market opportunities for biosimilars in Europe, US, and emerging market. And here I would say that Edric very nicely summarized some of these topics, and he couldn't go in. We jokingly used the word deep dive earlier, but he couldn't take a deep dive on emerging markets. So what I see overall, which I have noticed, is that Europe has been very advanced in biosimilars regulatory approvals. The generic biosimilar uptake has also been very high. Emerging markets has been in pockets, some places very high, some places lower, especially in those countries where there is local biosimilar manufacturing. Those are doing much better, I guess, like China, India, Korea, etc. And US was a late entrant, but now it's projected to be the most important market. So very wide topic. So your comments, please.
Sure, Samir. So see, like you said, this is a very wide topic, but one of the fundamental things which people, when they start looking at biosimilars, is that the US is a multi-billion-dollar market. And when you compare US with other markets like Europe and emerging markets, they are probably 20% of the size of US. But when we peel layers by layers of that US market size and start comparing it to Europe and emerging markets, it does not actually, say $2 billion versus $200 million. Many a times it comes out to be $200 million is bigger than $2 billion. Multiple reasons for that. Like you said, the acceptance and uptake of biosimilars in US for most companies has been slower than expected. So if and the amount of work which you need to do for US, that also, at least for now, is significantly higher than needed for Europe and the emerging markets. So these three markets, they actually, in my opinion, behave like, say, two separate clusters. One cluster is people who are focused for US. Second cluster is people who are focused for Europe and the emerging markets. So I club Europe and emerging markets in one because the development cost as well as the commercialization cost, if you go to Europe, gives you a significant advantage of entering into emerging markets. One example is if you have a approval in Europe, MENA is almost like automatic approval. TGA is one. Similarly, the acceptance of a European approved product is almost universal. So if you, in your development path, rather than going the full way like 100% for US, You can have a strategy where you think of Europe and clubbing that with emerging market. That I think can be a very sound strategy.
Edric, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that Dinesh is making, so I'd like to build on that. And the problem is, too, that it's impossible to make a decision as to which country or region you should focus on and no other. Because I think there are incredible benefits to each one, in fact. And the differences are significant depending on the specific product that you're going to investigate for development. I can tell you that when I looked at aflibercept, which is the molecule name for Eylea for macular degeneration, the US by itself was bigger than all other countries put together. But that doesn't mean that that's going to be the case for every product. And by the way, I shared in my last presentation some of the commercialization tactics that branded pharmaceutical firms use to protect their product, which they can do in the United States, which they cannot do successfully in some other key markets, for example, within Europe. You don't necessarily get that kind of percentage value capture that you could get in other areas. But on the other hand, I can't turn around and say, yes, I'll just focus on Europe then, because the US has giant products, but it's so complex and I won't be able to get a big enough piece of the pie. Because if I look at things like the Nordic countries, yeah, you can get very, very rapid uptake from the health systems in the Nordic countries. But what are you doing to get that? You're offering almost a 90% discount on a price that already started off half as low as the prices that you had in the US. So the unfortunate aspect of all this, very much how Dinesh summarized it into clusters, is you need to think about the clusters, that's one dimension, and then you have to look at the products. And you really have to do a deep dive to find out where you're going to play. Is it really going to be just individual markets, or are there reasons why a global approach could in fact be the most efficient and effective way for value capture?
Good point. Very good. And I think perhaps we can divide the further discussion into two parts. It's strategy and commercial, and then regulatory. So maybe we are still on strategy and commercial, so stick to that. And recently I was, and today in the morning in my presentation also I was mentioning, IQVIA has projected, and one of the trends they have projected for 2021 is, of course, based on the tremendous amount of backlog in the treatments, for example, in oncology, also in cardiology and others, because they took a backstage in pandemic period, and pandemic period is still not over. So it's likely that they will be bounced back, and there will be a lot of pressure on the healthcare system because they have to suddenly pay quite a lot for multiple treatments. And this is projected to bring more business to biosimilars, of course, to generics as well. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it something which is really going to happen in your opinion? I mean, it's just a high-level opinion I'm asking, and maybe there is your own logic to that. And so first to you, Dinesh, and then to Edric.
So Samir, I see it playing two ways. One, pandemic definitely has a part to play where regulatory, there's not only backlog, but there's a regulatory evolution also. So they have understood now, say vaccine approvals, right? So vaccine approvals with all the safety data, if they can be done within 1 year from top companies. So what is stopping from verifying and vetting the safety and efficacy data of a biosimilar where the biologic is already launched? So I think this will dispel a lot of fear in mind of specifically FDA, that if a company has done good safety data, then also it should take a lot of time for a biosimilar to be approved. So that is one thing. So regulatory learning also. And second thing is, now companies have a set template and pathway to follow. You do not need to reinvent the wheel now, either for your regulatory, also for your, say, clinical. For example, if you want to take one molecule in your portfolio, any new molecule, you just search even open sources. You'll be able to find really good designs for your preclinical, phase 1, phase 3, which have been followed and vetted by both EMA and FDA. So you just need to follow the path. So when you need to follow something, the timelines become short. So I think both factors will fall into this, and as FDA gets more experience of no safety related complications from earlier launched biosimilars, their confidence will become high in approving newer biosimilars also.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, Dinesh. I'm going to take a slightly different approach because you very well laid out for us what the regulatory implications were of everything that's happened. I'm going to take a slightly different vantage point here and just look at sales. And if I look at sales of products during the pandemic and how it might look in 2021, there's always sort of the base business that you have and the expected growth in the near term, the medium term, and the long term. And if I look at it that way, I would say the base business hasn't really changed for the most part. And perhaps the medium and long-term growth is not adversely affected either. It was just the growth that was expected due to naive patients entering the fray that we lost, because there were so many patients, so many people that said, I want to avoid ever going, unless it's a life or death situation, I want to avoid going to a physician's office. I want to avoid going to a health center, etc. So I think from a sales perspective, there was a significant dip in that entrance of naive patients. The question is, in 2021, can you get that back? I think in 2021, especially with our ever increasing understanding of COVID itself, as well as the rollout of the vaccine in some places, much more effectively than others, over time, that sort of a priori understanding of what the naive patient population could be will happen. And then the follow-on question is, can we get some of those naive patients that should have already triggered use in 2020 back? Hopefully, in many cases, yes. It's just a question of delay. But unfortunately, and from a humanistic perspective, this is what I'm so concerned about. In some cases, excuse me, it could be too late. You could be very rapidly progressing from one stage to another stage. So you could forever lose some of those patients as customers, but more importantly, some of those patients as actual lives. I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question, Samir, as to my view on the topic.
No, absolutely. And I think there are two things I could add over there is, so basically there is a dip, where that's what you're saying, which did happened in 2020. That
Right.
will get recovered with some bit of extra business. And it's also quite possible that this tapers out in 2022 because there were extra number of, additional patients this year, and then the situation goes back to normal next year. But what I also see here is that with more number of people this year taking biosimilars, the market sentiment, that's more of a financial way of saying, but the confidence of people in biosimilars is likely to increase as well. And so that would also positively impact the business perhaps. So maybe I go now in a logical sequence. So the first thing is to identify the products, then to take up the regulatory approval, then to do the development, then regulatory approval, and then commercial. So let me step back and go to identification. And one of the questions here in the list of questions for the panel discussion was how to find, evaluate, and plan for biosimilars market opportunities. Again, a very wide topic, but partly covered by Edric earlier. So any further comments on this one? I think it depends, to my understanding, it depends on the country or geography. It also depends on the disease burden for a particular type of therapy area. It depends on commercial attractiveness, etc. But what are your overall thoughts on this?
Sure, Samit. So see, these things what you lined out and also Edric lined out there, that they're extremely important. In addition to these, what I want to say is it also depends on basically risk appetite as well as this strategy for the player who wants to come in biosimilars. I'll give it with an example. Say if a big pharma player wants to enter into biosimilars, thinking that it's gonna be a pharma pathway and I can steamroll it the same way I can do a pharma product approval in US and Europe, I think that's very far from truth. and that leads to a lot of these negative sentiments that, oh, it's this biopharma is undoable, it's very difficult, because the premise which you start your work on, that's wrong. So if you treat these two products as different as they are, only in commercialization sense they work more closely. Other than that, your development, regulatory, commercialization is very, very different. So that's the first and most important thing. The company's mindset has to be geared up for taking up biosimilars. That will include investments, which are many tunes higher than whatever is thought for generics, okay, ever done for generics. Second thing is time. It's not a game where you're gonna get returns or approvals in 1 year, 1.5 to 2 years. So third thing is, again, if you launch a product like pregabalin in US, probably the windfall is gonna be much higher starting from day one. But just getting into US, getting into the J code, and then getting actual commercialization gains might take 2 to 3 years. We have seen it for various products. So this is a patience game, mindset game, and aptitude game. In addition to you seeing it fit for your strategy, which markets you want to go, those are important for sure. But in addition to what is already covered, I just want to add these things.
Yeah. Two things from my side that I would add. One is something that I think holds across all countries, and in my view, was something that was a truism long ago and is still a truism today. And then another part that has more to do with always paying attention to how markets are dynamic things and changing over time. So the first one, this systemic truism, I think geographically worldwide, is knowing exactly when you'll be able to submit your application and when you'll be able to launch relative to the competition is key. I can tell you that I have personally terminated products from various companies' pipelines based on how many players are going to be in the market and what's the order of entry and when are you actually going to be in. Because there is money to be made even 5 years, after you've launched the product, but the big money is early on. And this is why the fundamental difficult questions, especially in less mature countries such as the US, is if I'm one of the early entrants, that's great, but how do I at the same time drive market uptake upwards as rapidly as possible so that I get to capitalize on that early domination that I have with the biosimilar market. So that's my first sort of systemic truism, and I think that's always going to be true. You have to pay attention to when you can launch relative to competition. If you start too late, don't even bother. Use your resources more wisely on other products, frankly. The second thing that I wanted to touch is how we have to very, very actively and continuously look at markets and how they're changing. This even comes back to the pandemic itself. The pandemic didn't just affect the number of naive patients coming into the fray in places like, for example, oncology, and hence how biosimilars and how well they could do with their volume projections. It even affected how we engage our commercialization infrastructure. Telemedicine, for example, is something that I was working on and that McKinsey was working on long, long ago, and it never really took off. And we were always talking about, here's a PDA, here's a new app. Gosh, look at all these efficiencies we could bring into the market. Then suddenly, boom, the pandemic hits us and telemedicine becomes this raging thing where it's quite successful suddenly in the US. And in addition to that, and this to me is a bit of a corollary, suddenly teledetailing is also something that can occur.
Yeah,
those play much more of a significant role than ever in the past. Branded pharmaceutical firms are even using CSOs. So that changes now how you would pick products, because in the past, I would have said things like, you have to include commercialization input into how you select products. I still think that's true, but I don't think that you have to say, we have to stay in the oncology autoimmune space because that's the field force that we're going to develop. The ability to use telemedicine, teledetailing, which drastically reduces the size and scope of the field force that you use, and the increased relevance of CSOs allows us to now pick products and actually detail them very differently than we did in the past.
Yeah, I think this is an area which is moving very fast, changing very fast. So it will be very interesting to see what really happens this and next year, especially before things hopefully become more stable. So we have identified the products. Now it's the time for getting the development done. So one very broad question here is, which is for the panel, which was suggested by many of the participants of the conference. What are the major development challenges for biosimilars and how to tackle them? So some high-level opinion on this. So once again, we are only few minutes in this panel discussion. This is also a topic which people discuss in long conferences. But what are those nuances which are the challenges here?
So I'm not a development expert. So could I start and just give you my high level assertions here, and then Dinesh, I'm sure you can flesh this out in much more scientific detail. So I'm not a lab person anyway. That's not my background educationally, nor in the business world. I can just tell you that when I have working with R&D to actually manage their pipeline actively over time, the things that I was always doing is connecting development channels with the product channels as a whole. Keep in mind, I'm always the most worried about return on my investment and the timing of the launch. So anything that I can do to lower development and clinical development costs is a positive. Anything that I can do to shorten development and clinical development timelines is a positive, because that plays out orders of magnitude better in the commercial sense then. So some of the things that I would be looking for example, is how do you establish your initial analytics so profoundly, precisely, that you could potentially even obviate the need for phase 3 clinical trials. It can save enormous amounts of money, and it drastically, again, shortens the timeline to market. I can tell you that there's some products that shall remain nameless where the clinical development costs were $200 million. I can tell you of another product with another company that I was assisting, that again shall remain nameless, where we could get it from start to submission for $50 million. Stuff like that, to me, this interconnection and integration of commercial concerns, IP concerns, and R&D and clinical development, in my opinion, is what it's all about.
Well said. Yeah, Dinesh.
Thanks, Edric. So absolutely valid point. Now, what I want to add to that is, say, when this biosimilar field started, so we're talking about, say, $200 million coming to $50 million, and what we are seeing now is people wanting to go with FDA approval for less than $10 million. So see, it's a progressive, like we do progressive overload, it's a science of progressive download actually. So because like Edric said, it has been decoded that you do not need to put $50, $100, $200 million for clinical anymore, as FDA is more confident. So key to that is robust analytical development. And when we say that if you have a fingerprint like similarity, both FDA, EMA, or even if you go to PMDA, TGA, any of them, the moment your similarity is of that level, the questions about preclinical go away. You straight away show off a good amount of money there. Then phase 1 is sufficient for many of the products now, and this trend is gonna be more uniform now for the future products. Now coming to analytical development. So analytical development, where most of the people I've seen faltering are people who do part development, going to clinical, and then they have to come back to development again, whether it is a process development or analytical similarity. So my big like macro level suggestion is, whether it is the process or it is the analytics, please complete that step properly before going to clinics, because once you go to clinic, it becomes like a new development if you have to come back to analytics again or the process again. I've seen at least a couple of trials faltering where they had to make minor changes to the process and analytics went off like this. So have complete faith and trust in your analytics data and the process data, only then move to clinics. Do not be in a hurry to move to clinics. And if we talk about, say, Analytical, now again the template is there, very simplified. You follow the CQAs. If you are good in the CQAs, you have a good N for analytical similarity. So FDA, EMA, they're not gonna have an issue. And if FDA, EMA do not have an issue, EMA is gonna be a breeze. But key is analytical similarity. So that's my thought in this summit.
Yeah. Let me just build on that for a moment, Dinesh, because I loved how you laid that out. In the US, they use the term totality of evidence to get actual approval for the product. And what's interesting is that if you actually read the language as to what's required for approval, it's all based on just totality of evidence. At no point does the FDA require you to actually perform phase 3 clinical trials. And that's why what Dinesh is saying is exactly correct. If your analytics are strong enough, you can obviate the need. Here's the reason why some people did it, the phase 3 clinical trials, even when their analytics were incredibly strong. Because biosimilars in the US for a long time were so immature, so to speak, the market was so immature that physicians, what do physicians want to see? They're used to seeing clinical data. For them to hear terms like totality of evidence and biosimilar, especially in areas like rheumatology, I'm too uncomfortable. So I think the actual change in perspectives of patients, of providers, and the market as a whole is going to continue to influence, again, development, because it'll allow us to, again, do exactly what Dinesh said, base it all on analytics and obviate the need for phase 3. But it's not just about approval, it's about market approval too.
Yeah, so very well said, both of you, and quite outstanding comment. So some time back, I used to hear in biosimilars, process is the product. Now we should say process and analytics is the product. I mean, are the product or is the product, right? So if you are done with process and analytics, you have the product, and then everything else is not that, I mean, it's important, but not that important perhaps. Very interesting. So like Edric, with his first sentence, which one of the first few sentences which we talked about almost an hour back, was this is a 2-day topic. Yes. So we are already at the end of 30 minutes of this panel discussion. Time flew. And I would like to thank both of you for outstanding comments, insights, and also suggestions for success in biosimilars space. I'm pretty sure there will be some other questions coming up during the course of the conference, and we will be talking about them. So now we are having a networking break for 30 minutes. Those who stay in online, Zimona Myerska from BioSummit will explain once again how to take up one-to-one networking. So thanks again, and then we go offline. Martin, we are ready to go offline.
Thank you, Samir, so much.
Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Edric.
And as all of you can tell, Dinesh and I love discussing this. Yeah. So we look forward to continuing these conversations. It's just the beginning. So
yeah, BioSummit should arrange one separate conference with only 2 of you. And then we should run it for 2 days. At least.
Thanks, Samir.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.